welcome everybody. Karen, I'm ready for the first question.
Perfect. Okay. So we had a question come in. Are medical device regulatory affairs topics taught in any law school? What I often see is that lawyers that are aware of medical device regulations, probably a too small niche. There seems to be a kind of missing link between RA expert and a legal expert. RA experts usually are trained individual training seminars, but they don't have a full legal background. What do you say to that?
I think whoever said that kind of makes a very good point. In companies, regulatory and legal typically overlap, but they are seen as separate functions. And so if you do find somebody that combines both kind of legal as well as regulatory, that is definitely a really nice niche to be in. And I think, there's quite a few lawyers out there that specialize in the medtech industry, and that is essentially like their USP. The main thing to kind of recognize is that if we look at the skill sets from a regulatory perspective, so if I look at a regulatory manager in a company, for example, the type of background that they're coming from, they don't need to have a legal background. So they typically could maybe come from R&D. I know people that, have even come from marketing. I know people that have come from clinical. So they tend to come from less of a legal background per se. Whereas obviously, if you are advising as a lawyer to a company, you definitely need that legal background. And on top of it, it's great if you have the legal background and a scientific background on top of that. I did a really interesting podcast with Eric Vollebrecht really early on when we launched our Career Diaries by Elemed podcast, and we do talk about that and unicorn skill set of a regulatory lawyer. So definitely check that out if you haven't had the chance to listen to that. It's well worth a listen to.
Perfect, great. So we had another person asking, how can you apply for a position in QA or RA if you don't have a specific scientific background and a strong work experience within that field? What do you think should be the main skills that they should highlight in their resume?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's really, the question is really, how do you go about getting the experience? Because in my experience recruiting for companies, they always look first to what experience does this person have over like specifically the background. So for example, if you have somebody that has strong experience in regulatory and quality, but they don't have the scientific background, normally companies, will still consider that candidate. Whereas if you have somebody with a scientific background and no experience in regulatory and quality, those people are then kind of considered more entry level because they're not actually bringing experience to the table. And this is really the thing to highlight. Companies, when they're recruiting, they really look for experience, over only certificates. So if you have experience and certificates, it's a benefit. But if you only have certificates and no experience, it helps, but not as much as you might think. So then the question is, how do you go about getting the experience? So I would reframe that question. And it's something I talk about a lot. And I always suggest, as far as possible, to try to, in your studies, to try to sandwich your studies with some sort of internship or some sort of volunteering opportunity, even if you're, working on a small project, even if you're not being paid for it initially, just to get that experience. Because once you're able to say, I did 6 weeks doing this in a startup company, it really makes you stand out when you're going, up against other candidates that don't have the experience. And I would really recommend also joining regulatory associations like RAPS, building also a network of people that you can kind of connect with, because that will, that network will also help you when it comes to looking for a job.
Perfect. We had someone who would like to ask their question live. So I would pass over the word to Dominic.
Hello.
Hello,
I'm
Dominic.
more or less in the AI, the new challenge. How far AI must be understood the technology to able to guide R&D? Artificial intelligence, perhaps it helps more.
Yeah. So I think that's really interesting because, actually this week we've had 3 conversations with 3 different startups that are all moving into, well, they're all playing in that kind of AI health tech space. And something that's really come out of those conversations is that all of these companies really want somebody that has already got experience specifically with software as a medical device, and ideally experience of understanding how AI works. So if I look typically as well at what companies, ideally would look for in a regulatory candidate, they love people that have R&D backgrounds because, very often your main stakeholder is R&D. So if you've got that background, the consideration is, that you have the technical understanding of the products as well. So I definitely see, two options. One would be somebody that has that deep understanding from a development perspective of AI, and then moving more towards, a regulatory role and leveraging that experience. Or alternatively, let's say if you're a regulatory consultant or a regulatory specialist, really specializing in that software as a medical device or, health tech area, as opposed to being generalist across a wide product portfolio. I hope that answered your question.
Somehow.
I think something that suits quite well into this one is that someone was asking, I can see that most of the jobs are getting automated using, AI, ML, and NLP. So how can we make sure that our jobs are safe, and which areas do we need to get updated in?
So I think that's a really interesting question because, there is a lot of talk around automation replacing people. And I do believe that there are areas where automation will really be beneficial for companies, because it makes processes much more effective, efficient, reduces cost. And so I do think that in roles that are very, very repetitive, or activities that are really, really repetitive that can be automated, we might see those specific activities being replaced by technology. But equally, there are also positions, or let's say skills, that are opening up that are in high demand. So if I look, for example, at what I'm seeing trending right now, in particular clinical, in particular, medical writing, for example, maybe parts of the literature search might be, automation or technology might be able to help there, but the actual writing of the reports, I don't believe is something that will be, totally automated. So I think roles where, you still need to use scientific backgrounds, you still need to use strategic thinking, I would really recommend to start focusing on building a portfolio of experience around those skill sets in particular.
Perfect. You already touched on medical writers just now. So we've received a question that's asking, is there a big need of medical writers for QA, RA, clinical, and what kind of documents would medical writers prepare then?
So when I'm talking about medical writing, I'm talking specifically around clinical evaluation reports. So that's where we're seeing a lot of growth. With the MDR and the requirements specifically from a clinical perspective of MDR, we're seeing a lot of companies need to have more people writing those clinical evaluation reports. And companies are doing it in 2 or 3 different ways. Either they are building out teams internally for what they call medical writing, or regulatory writing, so people that are writing clinical evaluation reports, or they go into consultancies and outsourcing the whole project, so the consultancies therefore need the skill set. Or they might, if it's a startup, they might just give it to an independent consultant, and so therefore that there is also a need for individual contractors or consultants in that talent pool as well. So I definitely see this as a great area to start to develop skill set and competence.
Perfect. We had someone register a question asking, how easy and or difficult is it to get a clinical role in MedTech companies in Europe by being a candidate from India?
Yeah, it is. So the thing that we need to understand is how companies go about recruiting and what that process typically looks like internally. very often companies will always ask us to find someone locally because of the fact that their office is based, you know, in a certain city, and they like to try to build a hub. And then from there, if we don't find local candidates, they'll say, okay, well, let's look in Europe because it's easier to relocate people for permit reasons. And if not, then we'll start to look outside. And so the challenge is not specifically related to companies that you know, choose not to recruit candidates from specific countries. It's more to do with the limitations that they may that certain countries may have when it comes to stuff like work permits. The good thing that I can say, though, is that if you have a very specific experience that is hard to find, so a very specific expertise or knowledge or experience on a certain product that you don't find everywhere else, for example, as we spoke with Dominic earlier, for example, AI or software as a medical device, companies are able to build a much stronger case in order to then go out and apply for that work permit. And so I would always say, if you're going to try to look for roles like that, really understand what is your expertise and what are you bringing to the table, and then specifically target the companies that you know would benefit from that specific expertise that you have. The other thing is that I am hopeful that now, you know, with remote working, we are seeing companies offer a little bit more flexibility around where candidates are based, because, you know, the message that Elemed is putting out there to our clients is, you get a much better talent pool the wider you can be, right? So the more open you can be to where this candidate could be located, the more accurate you can be in really finding somebody with the specific experience that you need, because location is not a limitation anymore. So it's something that still needs to be improved, but I'm hopeful for the future. Karen, you're on mute.
I'm sorry about that. I just didn't want you to hear me clicking the whole time while I'm doing stuff on chat. So how far in advance should one start a new job search if they are already employed?
Yeah, so I did a video this week specifically on how to know when it's time to consider a new job. And I always say to people, the moment that you really stop learning and you start feeling like you're not being developed anymore and you're not feeling challenged, that's typically the time. The other thing that I can say is that it always takes longer than what you think, typically. You know, most recruitment processes from start to end will probably take something, you know, if it's fast, it will be 6 weeks, but on average, they're about 3 months. And if a company is, you know, really picky or really slow or doesn't quite know what they want, that could even take, you know, up to 8 months. The other thing to consider is seniority levels. So if you're going in for positions more at kind of specialist, senior expert, senior subject matter expert, typically there are more of those jobs out there, so it might be faster. Whereas if you're going for a role more at, you know, senior director, VP level, there may only be a handful of those a year that come in, and then it's kind of like maybe they're not even in the location that you would consider. So I can't give you an exact number, but I would really look at all of these factors and then allow yourself more time than what you think, because you never want to be in a position where you're at the point where you really desperately need to leave because you can't stand it anymore. You always want to allow yourself a bit of time in case it does take longer than expected.
Perfect. So how would you properly answer the question when a recruiter is asking you, how do you effectively manage conflicts when in a position or department with a big component of cross-functionality work or tasks?
So I'll answer this question like more generally. This is what we call a competency-based question. So for any questions where you're in an interview and they're asking you, how do you normally do something, or what is your typical response to something? In my interview coaching sessions, I always advise candidates that what you need to do is use an example, because what you need to do is, instead of talking about how you typically would do something or how you hypothetically might do something, to actually bring a concrete example to the table really speaks volumes to the hiring managers. And in order to do that, you want to use the STAR technique or the example-based technique, where you're clearly outlining, you know, actually this did happen to me. It happened when I was at this company. This was the background. This is what happened. And this is how I overcame that problem. And this was the result. and actually this is how it added value to the business, or this is how, you know, it was able to move the company forwards. So for any question that's asking, how would you normally deal with this type of situation, you always want to take it to the past tense and give a concrete example of a time when that's happened. And then if you really want to ramp it up, you want to take that example and say, what does this example show? So that example might show also leadership skills. It might show problem solving skills. It might show ability to overcome obstacles, or ability to collaborate with different departments. So then you can start to use these examples to reflect more than one type of question. And that's how you do a really effective interview prep. We've got quite a lot of documents on that. So I'll make sure that we have some links on interview prep in the follow-up as well.
Perfect. This is a very specific question. Someone is asking, I have experience of 5 years in quality and about 2 to 3 years in regulatory, all in medical devices. I consider now going to a biosafety job in the same sector in order to know more about that topic. To me, this seems a nice addition to my knowledge in order to go later, maybe, you know, again into a QA or work as a consultant. What do you think about this step?
I think, you know, always having specialisms and other areas of expertise that differentiate you will always make you stand out as a candidate. The one thing, though, that I would highlight is really to understand where you want to go. So if your end goal is to become a consultant, if you are stepping out of regulatory and quality right now, when MDR is really the hot topic and it's all about building portfolio of experience around helping companies through MDR, and then you want to kind of like jump back into regulatory and quality, I know that a lot of hiring managers would ask, what relevant experience do you have that's recent? So if you are making a move outside of regulatory and quality with a view to jump back in, I would really suggest, you know, that you're thinking about, how can I make sure that my QARA knowledge is kept up to date, and actually that I'm still continuing to build experience in that field, not only training and certification alongside that. So some sort of combined approach would probably be what I would recommend.
Perfect. Another quite personal question. What are the chances of a 50-year-old woman with many years of experience in quality assurance to find a new job in the QA market? What could help to increase the possibilities of a successful application? And is age an obstacle, or maybe in which countries could it actually be an obstacle?
Yeah, oh, this question, you know, for me is, I truly believe in always recruiting the best person for the job, irrespective of age, gender, you know, ethnicity. And, you know, it's a question that, you know, it makes me sad to have to answer, because I really truly believe that if you've got relevant experience and you're adding value, age should not really be the thing that you're worried or concerned about. You know, the one thing that I would really highlight is, if you do have relevant experience in quality, really to make sure that, you know, you're showcasing that experience when you're applying for roles. And the other thing that I normally advise to my candidates is, if you're coming up against the same objection over and over again through interviews or through applications, and let's say you know that is becoming an issue for you, have a really good answer prepared for it, and don't wait for them to raise it, but say, you may be thinking that, but actually, you know, this is what I would say, and this is the value that I bring. Or, you know, other companies have said to me that my age is a limiting factor, but did you know that I can do X, Y, and Z, or I have experience in X, Y, and Z. And so I really feel that I can help you for the next set amount of time that I'm willing to dedicate to this. The other thing, you know, I know companies that really, if somebody has a lot of experience, you know, they would really look for the right candidate. So just make sure you're targeting the right companies, speak to recruiters, understand, you know, what's driving, you know, companies to recruit those skill sets, what's the reason behind that, and really see where you can position yourself. But really understand what the objection is and call it out in interviews.
Perfect. The next question, you already touched on the first part, but I think the second part is really interesting. So when is a good time to move to another company? We've already basically covered that. but the person is also asking, or to pursue a consulting career. So how do you make the decision if it's now time to maybe move to another company, or step into consulting?
So consulting is one of these words that I would love to understand more what that person means by consulting. So do you mean working for a consultancy, being permanently employed, or do you mean taking the jump and like being a contractor or a freelancer? On the second topic, so literally jumping out of a permanent job and becoming self-employed and going out and finding your own clients, I've done a video on my LinkedIn profile that you can also watch, which is the things you need to know before jumping into becoming a freelancer. And I'm sure we've also touched on this topic in the Career Diaries podcast. So I did a really nice one with Michelle Lotz, who some of you may know is a consultant, and she spoke about when she moved from a permanent employee to consultancy, and also what it meant to actually set up her own consultancy. If the question is more related to working for a consultancy as a permanent employee, I would look at that career step in the same way that I would consider, any career step. So, you might be applying for roles as a regulatory manager, but you might apply for roles within medical device companies as a regulatory manager. But you could also, in parallel, consider consultancy to be an option, because the experience that you would have would also be relevant in that role. They offer two very, very different environments. One is very much immersed in a company, a culture, that product. But if you're working in a consultancy, the benefit is that you really get a chance to see horizontally across loads of different companies. So you build experience very quickly. You typically are constantly thinking on your feet and having the chance to work on a variety of different types of projects and products at the same time. So that can also be really rewarding.
Perfect. We have another question that's basically two. So the first part of the question is around CV tips and how to increase, the appearance of your CV. And the other one is about, LinkedIn and how to enhance your professional brand.
Is this a live question, Karen?
Yeah, but unfortunately, Stefan is on here, but he's not replying to me in chat. So I'm not sure if he's willing to ask it live or not.
Okay. We're going to launch a poll on this actually, because this is something that keeps coming up. In answer to the question, how do you improve your CV? That is a whole 1 hour discussion potentially on its own, and I'm conscious of time. So number one, we've got a CV checklist and a CV template that I will make sure we send across, that I really recommend that you take a look at. But it's all about highlighting not only responsibilities, but accomplishments. So too often I see people talking about responsibilities, but they don't talk about the output of what they do. And I always say to people, how effective you are at your job, is determined by the results that you provide for the company. Your responsibilities is your job role, but how good you are at your job is basically reflected in the results that you generate for the company. So always think about accomplishments and results, and make sure that you include those on your CV. In terms of LinkedIn, I have launched a poll because I would be interested to see if people would get value in learning more around how to use LinkedIn to either build your professional brand and building thought leadership. And if that's the case, then in the next couple of weeks, I will do a workshop. So I can see here that generally people are saying yes. 100% of you have said yes who've answered. So we'll make sure that we launch something specifically on these topics, in particular LinkedIn, and make it tailored to your job roles in order to make sure that you're maximizing that as well, because that's another big topic.
Perfect. How would you go about getting companies, recognizing the technical skill set as a mean to allow promotion, rather than having to move into a managerial role, which seems to be the only way to get promoted?
Can you read it one more time for me, Karen?
Yeah. So how would you go about getting companies to recognize technical skill sets as a mean to allow promotion rather than having to move into a managerial role, which seems to be the only way to get promotion?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because career progression isn't only about moving up and becoming a team leader and a director, but career progression is also associated with complexity and really digging in and becoming a subject matter expert. I think it's really important to understand within your company what do the career progressions, what do those routes look like. So I would say that you need to really engage your manager and actually ask, what does career progression look like for someone who doesn't want to follow a leadership route within this company? And hopefully they'll have an answer for you. And if they don't, maybe it will provoke some food for thought. But if it's really like, you know, there are no options, you're basically going to be in this role for the rest of your life unless you want to be a manager, I would suggest maybe asking them, would that be open for consideration if I hit certain milestones? Would you see that as criteria, you know, for promotion? And if really, you know, the company is not receptive to it at all, then you might want to start to consider looking at a company that does facilitate that sort of career progression. Consultancies are great for that in the sense where typically you can build up your competence and your seniority by working on more complex projects, starting to manage client relationships, but at the same time not having to follow a leadership route in order to be promoted.
Perfect. We have a pharmacist on who has strong clinical and primary care experience, and that person would like to go into industry. So is there any recommended route, you know, that you can advise, or any certificate that would make the application more appealing?
Yeah, so I would definitely look for roles within manufacturers in the clinical departments in particular. You know, they really value clinical experience. I would really start to look as well at saying, okay, well, what experience do I have? And maybe speaking to a few recruiters and understanding what is the experience that I have and how does that look in industry. So really trying to match what functions specifically value the experience that you already have. So then you can really go out and target those specific roles. So my advice would be to speak to a number of different recruiters and get a few different perspectives on that, and then start to look in manufacturers or in companies at the job descriptions and the requirements specifically in the job descriptions, and then start to tailor your CV and experience around what you understand those requirements to be and what experience you have that would be valuable for that specific role.
Perfect. I wanted to go to another question, but I just had a message come in. Someone is asking, what is the scope for regulations in combination products around the world? And what kind of expertise do you feel that people in RA jobs need if they're working on combination products?
What kind of expertise do we need if we're working on combination devices?
Yeah.
Combination devices is really a specialist area. So typically, if you are coming from a pharma background, but you have medical device experience, but you haven't worked on combination devices, that pharma background usually is highly valued by companies, for example. Or if you, typically we don't see it so often the other way around. So really it's, you know, if you have regulatory device experience, but you want to move more into combination devices, some sort of pharma background or some sort of qualification or some sort of training that lends itself really nicely to pharma, you'd be able to then kind of leverage all that experience together and take it to a company specifically for combination devices. The most important thing is to understand like the two different approval routes and what that looks like. So, and then on top of that, obviously there's more complexity right now with MDR and what that means for combination devices. So, you know, making sure that you're totally up to date with that and the process and some of the contentious issues and questions, because I know that there's still debate out there with regards to that. I think it's important to make sure that you can demonstrate clear understanding around what is actually going on specifically in the combination space.
Perfect. Can you recommend a way to find an RA career mentor if you work for a small company with no one suitable internally? I think that person, already tried to hit certain, routes within the industry, but is looking for a mentor.
I can't not say it. We've got Elements Mentoring Academy is perfect for that. So in collaboration with RAPS, in partnership with RAPS, we've launched Element Mentoring Academy, which is specifically designed for that. It has 3 main pillars. Pillar number 1 is to literally be partnered with somebody who is typically senior in the industry within your area of expertise, that will be your go-to impartial third person that literally will help you give advice, thoughts, ask questions when you need that support. And that's typically monthly. The second thing is that there's like training that happens typically twice a month on specific areas focused on soft skills in order to be effective in your role. And the third piece is a support network. So we connect all the mentees together so they can celebrate successes together, so that you don't feel like you're going on this journey on your own. And we've had some honestly incredible feedback from our mentees. So if you really are feeling a little bit isolated in your role or in your company, I would really recommend checking it out. We have an early bird offer. We have a discount for RAPS members if you're already a RAPS member. We have different pricing structures. We have the ability to pay in monthly installments as well. So Karen, let's make sure we include a link to our mentoring program as well. And you get RAP credits.
We'll do that. Perfect.
Okay.
I'm currently a senior RA manager. Yeah, sorry, I just had to. So we're done with all the pre-registered questions for this event. But as this is a part 2, we're going back to the questions that we haven't answered in the first part. So I just had to flip pages, but I'm back now.
Okay.
I'm currently a senior regulatory affairs manager and interested in developing further potential becoming a team leader. What are good tasks to take over to be more qualified for a leadership role like that, besides being, just a project lead?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the obvious one is to be a project lead, so you start to build competence there. But then what you could look to do is mentorship. Ask. Well, you don't need to ask even, right? Like if there's somebody in your team that is struggling or a bit more junior, or offer yourself as it doesn't need to be a formal mentoring relationship, but to help them. And then you can maybe look to formalize that with your manager. Managers typically don't have a lot of time, so anything that makes their life easier or will facilitate the success of their team, typically if you present it in the right way, they'll respond well to it. So I would start to look for internal mentorship opportunities within the team, or some companies have structured mentoring programs that you can be part of. So I would look to go into that as a mentee, but also as a mentor if there's the possibility to do that. Obviously, we have external programs like Elements Mentoring Academy. So you could register to be a mentor on our program and start to develop those skills there. Because ultimately, when it comes to leadership, it is about what experience do you have developing someone? What experience do you have building someone up and making them successful, or making them independent, or helping them to achieve X, Y, and Z? So if you can still demonstrate that, albeit externally, that's still a step forwards.
Perfect. Another question that we had is, if you're working in a small company, often you have like many different responsibilities, right? But not really as much in depth. So how could that person transition to a larger organization with a more defined role?
So the question is to really make sure that you actually also understand the difference between a small and a large company as well, because typically when you're in a small company, you maybe be a little bit more generalist, but you might have more exposure. It might be faster moving. When you're in a big company, you might only be focused on one specific activity, and it might be very, very different. So I would always say, first, really try to understand what is the difference and make sure that you absolutely want to do that. And then secondly, what you want to do is, if you're looking to go into a big company, you want to apply for the roles where that small company thinking is an advantage. So what big companies like about people coming from smaller companies is that typically they're very hands-on. They're able to respond very quickly to changing situations. They're able to bring a broad variety of knowledge. So you kind of want to look for roles like that. And so typically roles in project management are quite good. For example, if you've built a quality management system before and it's something you like and you want to continue on with that, you could look for roles specifically within quality systems within a company. If you've done worked for a small company and you've kind of gone through that CE marking process, but they only have one product, you might then want to look for a regulatory role that sits very close to product development within a company, where you can maybe be in charge or support regulatory projects. So it's about understanding what is it in your experience, even if it's in a small company, and then looking, and targeting roles that are specifically going to benefit from your experience there. Karen?
Perfect. Great. Someone is asking about an overview of the different careers that you can take in the medical device area.
Yep, that's a really broad question, but I did do I did do a specific video on career paths in medical devices. Also, if you are entry level and you're interested, I will also be doing a webinar for the University of Cambridge MedTech on general career paths in MedTech, and that will be recorded and we'll make it available to our network. So keep an eye on our website for that, and we'll be sharing that in the next couple of weeks.
Perfect. How would a transition be when one decides, to go from an RA into a QA role, and how long do you think would that transition take?
I think it depends on the company that you're in as well, right? Like quality and regulatory is really, really closely linked, and it might even be that you're already doing things that are considered to be quality in your regulatory role, or vice versa. So I think you need to really understand, like, what experience do you already have that's cross-transferable, and then look to leverage that in the next role. It could be really quick, it's difficult to put a timeline on that, because in some companies, a good example is post-market activities. In some companies, they consider that to be regulatory, and in other companies that they consider that to be a quality activity. So there are some that are kind of like, it will depend on the organizational structure of your company and how it's actually considered. But you will, if you literally write a list of all the things that you do in your role and really try to understand what truly is regulatory and what truly is quality, I think you'll see that you're probably already doing both. And so that ability to leverage is going to be much easier.
Perfect. Elena, what tip would you give someone to best market a zigzag career?
Yeah. What's a zigzag career?
Well, probably someone who maybe is, hopping between different roles. That's what I imagine behind it.
The question I have is, for people that have, let's say, less traditional backgrounds or less traditional career routes, it's what experience do you have that others don't? What skills do you have that others don't, that would be valuable in the role in which you're applying for? And really focus on that when you're in interview.
Perfect. How would you manage to explain to your new employer, or possibly in an interview, when you were fired from your current job, but it wasn't because you were underperforming, but because, there was unhappiness between you and the line manager?
I think, people sometimes make wrong decisions, right? Like, hiring managers might sometimes hire the wrong people, and equally candidates might sometimes join the wrong companies. And I think with this, it's about just being honest and saying, I joined the company, with these expectations or with these intentions, but ultimately we realized quite quickly on that actually it wasn't the right cultural fit. And instead of kind of sitting in this role for years coasting, we had a discussion and decided it was best to part ways. But what that means is that I'm very clear on what I am looking for from a company, and you know, that's been able to give me a little bit more clarity. And so I think just being open, I wouldn't hide something like this, but I would really be open about it. And if the company, if you're even in an interview and they haven't asked you that question, you can be sure that they're thinking it. So again, like I did mention about the age thing, if you think that people are having a specific objection about you or a specific concern about your profile, I would call it out. So by saying, looking at your CV, you might be wondering why after, you know, 3 months or whatever, you know, I left this company, and let me just handle that and explain that to you now. Even if they don't ask you the question, call it out and address it, because you kind of disarm them, and they can't then really continue to have that big concern if you're upfront and honest about it.
Perfect. This one is probably from someone who just graduated, it looks like. How do you get your very first job as RAQA?
Okay, so the one thing to highlight, so I have done a webinar on transitioning from academia to industry, so check that out. But the thing I would highlight is, you know, I wouldn't apply via recruiters. I would apply directly to companies, and I would apply for a broad spectrum of positions, not only regulatory and quality, but I would really apply for a broad spectrum of positions that really complement the experience that you have. I would also look for small companies rather than really big companies, because small companies typically tend to be understaffed. They typically tend to be a little bit more flexible in the requirements, because they maybe don't have the brand that the big global corporates have. But equally, small companies as a first experience is honestly great, because, you know, we kind of touched on that earlier. You get a bit more generalist experience, but you really get a chance to go into lots of different topics. You build a kind of urgency about yourself that you won't realize that you have until you go into a corporate and realize everything's quite slow moving. And I really would recommend that as a first step.
Perfect. And if you're applying with a company who is hiring for an on-site role, how would you convince them to make that switch to a remote role?
It's difficult for one candidate to convince a company to change their whole policy. And typically what we find is that companies don't like to make exceptions for individuals. I think this is something you need to be asking during the interviews, and great questions are around, you know, what were your main learnings during COVID? What have you found to be, what did you learn when everybody had to work from home? How are you going to be applying that moving forwards? You know, what do you believe the future to look like with regards to home office? And to really be asking those questions, because I think some, companies that are doing it in the right way are already thinking these things. You know, they've already trialed it, they've seen it can work, they've seen its limitations as well. But the forward-thinking companies are thinking about how can we use this and leverage it and make it better, but still be able to access good talent. If you're asking these questions and the companies are like, we went remote, we hated it, everybody needs to be back in the office and there's no chance, I don't think you're going to have much success trying to convince them otherwise.
And how do you evaluate so how could a person evaluate if they are rather a QARA manager or a QARA expert specialist kind of level?
What do you mean by manager, Karen?
Well, I think manager probably in this case is like a team leader manager, right? Someone who's having a team.
Yeah, it's a good point, because not everybody is a leader, and not everybody is an expert. I think that the key thing is like the question, do you love the details? Like, if you really love the product, if you really love being in the details and the challenges of really getting stuck in and involved in the details of what your role entails, and you want to keep that, then subject matter expert is probably the more realistic route for you to take, because when you become a manager, you step further away from that, and it essentially becomes, when you have a team of a certain size, it becomes about HR. And then when you have a department of a certain size, it becomes about politics. So as long as, like, I think you need to have that real understanding of yourself as a person as well. Do I want to step away from the details? Do I enjoy that, like, HR element of what management is? And then, you know, do I find it exciting to kind of navigate corporate politics and influence through matrix structures versus really staying close to the detail and working on challenging projects and products? That will help you try to identify, I think, also what route to take.
Great. And how many years from your experience do you usually need in QARA to be able to then take on a team leader role?
How many years of experience do you need to have? I think it really depends on your potential. It's a difficult one. You know, it also depends on the companies that you've been in. I mean, and also what have you achieved? Typically, the route looks like this: expert, senior expert. Senior expert is kind of like the 5-year mark, and then you kind of get to senior expert. You might start mentoring people. You might have one direct report, and then you become a leader, typically around 6-7 years, something like that. Some people do it faster. If you join a startup and you're the first one in regulatory and quality and they're growing, quite likely you're going to be given the opportunity to maybe recruit, you know, someone at entry level and train them up faster than if you go into a corporate matrix that has a much bigger structure. So it depends is the classic regulatory answer.
Great. So if you've been offered a job or a contract by a company, what would you say is the best way to say that you're not interested? You know, either, you know, by calling or email, what would you say?
Okay, so my first question to that would really be kind of like, why, right? So why would you not be interested if you've got to an offer stage in a process? Typically, when you get to offer stage in a process, the only real reason, if the company have handled it right, or if you're working with a recruiter who's managed it correctly, the only real reason would be maybe salary, or you have another offer and you literally can't take two. If you have like concerns about the company, I would always raise that much earlier on. If you have concerns about the position, I would always raise that much earlier on and not let it get to offer stage. But if it's literally that you're choosing between two opportunities and this is the one that you're kind of letting go, it's important to be honest throughout the process. So, I am considering a couple of other options. I really like this position because of X, Y, and Z. But obviously, I do have a couple of other options on the table. So you kind of like already let them know that. And then ultimately, it doesn't come as a massive shock. What companies hate is major shocks in the process. So if they've taken a candidate through 3 stages, the candidate's been saying they're interested, they've been saying, I want to go through this process, and as they move through the process, it's a confirmation of interest. It's a confirmation of interest, and the company doesn't know that they're interviewing with other roles, or that they're not really considering to change, or they just want to get this offer to leverage their current salary package, which I recommend you absolutely should never do. Then you can understand that if a company makes an offer, they're expecting somebody probably to accept it, especially if they're offering what the candidate said that they want. Then it comes as a major shock at the end of the process, and that creates bad experience on both sides. So I think you need to manage it effectively and avoid surprises, so that, if they already know you've got a couple of options on the table and you say to them, look, I've got a couple of offers on the table, they're going to make their best offer that they can for you. And if it's still not one that you want to accept, you're going to say to them, look, it was very compelling. However, I really feel that I've been offered an opportunity that matches my career goals, or that is a little bit more in line with my career goals. Something like that.
Perfect. Are there any trainings that you could recommend to do, like QARA career training in terms of experience? I think this is rather technical than like soft skilly.
Yeah, so specific training with regards to quality and regulatory.
Yeah.
I would look at RAPS for sure. Like they have great training dedicated, specifically to these topics. And again, training is great, but you always want to supplement it with experience. So if you ultimately want to go for improving your career in a leadership route, you need to be working on the soft skills as well. You speak to any leader, we did a leadership roundtable for our mentees yesterday, and they all talk about the fact that to be successful, if leadership is the route that you want to go down, it's not just about technical expertise. It's about how do you influence, how do you build relationships, how can you understand the wider picture, how do you coach, how do you bring people, how do you develop people? So you need to understand what your end goal is first, and then navigate, okay, well, what do I need to do in order to get there?
Great. How much job hopping is considered unstable by HR or hiring managers?
Don't like this question because I don't think that it's really job hopping. Okay, so I think it's all about what can you demonstrate in each role. So if you are spending 2 years in a role, but every 2 years you're moving on, we see that really often in tech in particular. People don't tend to spend very huge amounts of time, but they work on really big projects, and they can show over that 2-year period major impacts that they've had. And then it's considered, okay, because it's like, what value are you adding to the company? Where was the company when you joined, and where was the company when you left? And what did you do to move them forwards? So, I think, and I know that companies prefer people that have got real, true portfolios of experience that is varied and valid for what they're looking for, as opposed to somebody who's sat in a role, who hasn't learned anything or hasn't developed anything, not challenged for years and years and years, just to count years on their CV. So I would focus more on what have I achieved, what outputs can I demonstrate, and look at that more when you're considering career moves and when you're, in interviews as well. I've done a video on that today or yesterday.
We'll make sure to include it in the resources. We already touched on that RAPS is doing a course, but here's someone that's new in the QARA field and is looking for certification specifically in medical or clinical area. Is there anything that's like in the industry recommended as like a gold standard that you need to have when you're moving into that kind of position?
I do think that there are some associations that it's worth being part of and looking more into. I know MWA, so for medical writing, they're very involved in that area. So I would definitely check that out. And RAPS also have a course, or they have recently released a course on specifically regulatory writing, which I would recommend checking out as well.
Perfect. On my clock, we only have 1 minute left. How is it on yours, Elena?
I have 3 minutes left, Karen.
Okay, so let's do another question then. I don't want to double up, so as this is from part 1, we already covered a couple of them today.
If anyone,
yeah, I think most of them we covered off.
Well, then we've done it. We've done it, Karen.
Perfect.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you got value from this. I'm feeling a bit frazzled. That was quite intense, but I hope that you got value, and I hope I answered all of your questions. If you have further questions, please let me know. Send me a direct message on LinkedIn. We've referenced loads and loads of resources, so we're going to make sure that you all have access to them as a follow-up. And thanks very much for answering the poll. I will make sure that we action something on some sort of LinkedIn workshop as well. So thank you all for joining. Have a lovely day. I can see all the thank yous coming in on the chat, so thank you all so much. Have a lovely day and a lovely rest of your week. Thank you, Karen, for moderating and for asking all those fantastic questions, and let's keep in touch.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.